The note wasn't supposed to change the show. Dean Martin had received hundreds of requests over the years, song requests, jokes, even napkins with phone numbers. Most of them never made it past the stage. But this one did. A stagehand handed Dean a folded letter during the middle of his set. He glanced at it casually, expecting something light. Instead, he slowed down. The music behind him softened. Dean adjusted his glasses and began reading quietly. At first, the audience kept talking, clinking glasses, laughing. Then Dean stopped mid-sentence. He looked toward the front row. A thin man sat there, watching him carefully. Dean tried to continue, but before he reached the final line, his voice broke. And in a room built for laughter, Dean Martin suddenly had to decide whether to finish the show or finish the letter. The note wasn't supposed to change the show. Dean Martin had received hundreds over the years, song requests, jokes, even napkins with phone numbers. Most never made it past the stage. But this one did. A stagehand handed Dean a folded letter in the middle of his set. He glanced at it casually, expecting something light. Instead, he slowed down. The band softened without being told. Dean adjusted the paper and began reading quietly. At first, the audience kept laughing, glasses clinking, waiters moving between tables. Then Dean stopped mid-sentence. He looked toward the front row. And before he reached the final line, Dean Martin couldn't continue. The room, built for laughter, suddenly fell still, and half the audience realized something had just changed. Las Vegas showrooms weren't built for quiet moments. They were built for movement, waiters sliding between tables, glasses clinking, soft laughter rolling under the music. Even during the biggest performances, the room never fully stopped. That was part of the culture. The show flowed, the drinks flowed, and the audience expected entertainment, not interruption. And nobody understood that rhythm better than Dean Martin. By the time he walked onto that stage, Dean had perfected a style that looked effortless. A drink in one hand, a microphone in the other, and a relaxed smile that made every performance feel like he was simply spending time with friends. If something unexpected happened, he joked his way through it. If a moment felt heavy, he lightened it. That was the rule. Keep it smooth. Keep it moving. Never let the room feel uncomfortable. Because in a Las Vegas showroom, silence wasn't just unusual, it was risky. A quiet room meant attention shifting, momentum breaking, and in some cases, management stepping in to keep things on track. Dean knew all of that, but as he held the letter in his hands that night, he also knew something else. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a request. And finishing the letter the way the room expected suddenly didn't feel possible. Dean kept looking at the page. The band waited, and for the first time that night, Dean Martin didn't move on. At first, the interruption felt small. Dean looked down at the letter, smiled faintly, and made a quiet remark about receiving requests during the show. The audience responded with light laughter, the kind that usually came before a joke or a song change. He unfolded the paper slowly. The first line was simple. The writer thanked Dean for the music, for the years of performances, for nights that had meant more than the audience ever realized. Dean nodded slightly as he read, his voice softer than usual. Nothing unusual yet. He finished the first sentence and glanced briefly toward the crowd, as if acknowledging the sentiment. A few people leaned forward, curious. Others continued talking, assuming the moment would turn into a story or a punchline. Dean continued. The second paragraph shifted. The letter mentioned hospital rooms, late nights, and how Dean's records had played quietly while doctors came and went. The writer described listening to Dean's voice during difficult days, days when the future felt uncertain. Dean slowed down. The band, sensing the change, softened their playing until the music was barely noticeable. Waiters passing between tables moved more carefully now, aware that the room's tone was shifting. Dean kept reading, but he had stopped smiling. The audience noticed. Conversations at the front tables faded first. A few people near the back were still talking, but even they began to lower their voices. Something about Dean's posture, the way he held the paper a little closer, the way his voice lost its easy rhythm, told them this wasn't part of the act anymore. Then came the third section of the letter. The writer explained that he had come to see Dean that night, even though getting there hadn't been easy. He described wanting to hear Dean one last time, not through a record, not through a radio, but in the room, surrounded by the same laughter that had filled so many better days. Dean paused. He looked up. Somewhere in the front row, the man who had written the letter sat quietly, watching him. No wave, no attempt to draw attention, just a small, steady expression, as if he already understood what Dean was feeling. Dean glanced back at the page. He continued reading, but now his voice carried differently, slower, quieter, more careful. The room had nearly stopped moving. The orchestra leader lowered his hands completely. Even the soft clinking of glasses faded. Dean reached the final paragraph, and before he began the next line, he hesitated. Dean kept holding the paper, but he had stopped reading for a reason. Dean stood still for a moment, the paper held gently between his fingers. The room, once filled with quiet movement, had slowed almost completely. A waitress near the side aisle paused mid-step, unsure whether to continue walking. A couple at one of the front tables lowered their glasses without taking a sip. Even the faint background music had faded into silence. Dean looked down at the letter again. He adjusted it slightly, like he was making sure he hadn't missed a line. Then he read the next sentence. His voice came out softer than before. The letter described how the writer had followed Dean's career for years, watching from the audience whenever possible, listening from afar when he couldn't. It wasn't dramatic or exaggerated, just simple words, written carefully, like someone trying to say something important without asking for too much. Dean swallowed quietly. He shifted his weight, something he rarely did during a performance. Usually, he moved with effortless ease, leaning into jokes, drifting across the stage. But now he stayed in one place. Someone in the audience coughed, the sound louder than it should have been in the stillness. Dean continued reading. The letter mentioned family, how the writer had shared Dean's music with loved ones, how certain songs had marked moments in his life. There was nothing theatrical in the writing, just gratitude, written plainly. Dean glanced toward the front row again. The man sat quietly, hands still folded, watching with a calm expression. He didn't seem nervous. If anything, he looked relieved, like he had already said what he needed to say. Dean looked back down. He reached the final lines. He lifted his glass slightly, then set it down without taking a drink, a small motion that didn't go unnoticed by the orchestra leader, who kept watching carefully. Dean read the next sentence, then another. The final line was just below. He paused again. A few seconds passed. No one moved. Dean tried to continue, but when he opened his mouth, the words didn't come right away. He lowered the letter slightly, blinking once, then again. His expression remained calm, but the ease that usually defined him had disappeared. The man in the front row didn't look away. Dean took a small breath. He raised the paper again. The audience expected him to finish reading. Instead, Dean stopped, and in that quiet moment, Dean Martin made a decision that no one in the room had expected. Dean lowered the letter slowly. For a moment, he just stood there, holding it gently in one hand, the microphone in the other. The room stayed quiet, waiting for him to finish. But instead of reading the final line, Dean looked toward the front row. His voice, when he spoke, was softer than anyone had heard it that night. He didn't raise it. He didn't try to lighten the moment. He simply said that some words were too personal to read out loud, and that the man who wrote them had already said everything that mattered. Dean folded the letter carefully. Then he stepped closer to the edge of the stage. The man in the front row looked up, surprised but calm, as Dean leaned down slightly and handed the letter back to him. There was no dramatic gesture, no grand announcement, just a quiet exchange between two people in a room full of witnesses. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then Dean reached out and gently placed a hand on the man's shoulder. The audience watched in complete silence. Someone near the back set down a glass. A chair shifted quietly. No one clapped yet. The moment didn't call for applause. Dean gave the man a small nod. Then he stepped back toward the microphone. The balance in the room had changed, and everyone there understood that the show wasn't quite the same anymore. For a few seconds after Dean stepped back, no one moved. The silence felt different now, not uncertain, but respectful. The kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. Dean stood near the microphone, his posture calm again, but the ease in his expression hadn't fully returned. He glanced once more toward the front row, where the man still sat, holding the folded letter carefully in his hands. Then Dean did something subtle. Instead of reaching for a joke, the move everyone expected, he nodded toward the orchestra. The band began playing softly. Not a big number, not something upbeat, just a slower song, one that let the room stay in the moment without forcing it away. The audience listened differently now. Conversations didn't resume right away. Waiters moved quietly, careful not to break the atmosphere that had settled over the showroom. Dean sang with the same smooth voice he was known for, but there was something quieter beneath it, a focus that made even familiar lyrics feel more personal. People noticed. A few tables leaned forward. Some guests stopped drinking entirely. Even the staff near the walls stood still longer than usual. When the song ended, the applause came. Not loud at first, but steady. It grew slowly, like the room was acknowledging something more than just a performance. Dean gave a small nod of thanks. He didn't mention the letter again. He didn't explain what had happened. But the rest of the show carried a different tone. The humor returned gradually, the easy charm slipping back into place. Yet the audience watched him more closely now, like they had seen something rare behind the performance. By the time the set ended, people stood as he left the stage. Not everyone knew the full story, but they understood they had witnessed a moment that wasn't planned, one that felt more genuine than anything scripted. And long after the lights dimmed and the tables cleared, the memory stayed with the people who had been there, because they hadn't just watched Dean Martin perform. They had watched him pause and choose something quieter than entertainment. That's what people often missed about Dean Martin. The voice was smooth. The jokes came easy, and the glass in his hand made everything look effortless. He built a career on making the hard part seem simple, like nothing could really shake him. But moments like that night told a different story. Dean understood something about people. He knew that sometimes the most important thing wasn't the perfect note or the perfect punchline. Sometimes it was knowing when to slow down, when to let a quiet moment matter. In a room built for laughter, Dean chose silence. In a place where the show always moved forward, he paused for one person. And he didn't need to explain it, because everyone there could feel it. The man in the front row didn't stand. He didn't ask for attention. He simply held the letter as Dean walked off stage. A small exchange that meant more than any performance that night. Years later, people would still remember the songs, the jokes, the easy charm. But the ones who were in that room remembered something else. They remembered the night Dean Martin stopped the show, not to entertain the crowd, but to honor a single voice in it. And that may be the real reason the room never forgot him.